It didn't happen in a formal summit. It didn't happen in a press conference. It happened in a federal courtroom in America's own Supreme Court, and by the time it did, the most powerful office on the planet had already lost. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court struck down Donald Trump's tariffs, not reduced, not adjusted, struck down, ruled unconstitutional. The entire legal architecture of economic war that Trump had spent over a year constructing against Canada demolished by his own country's highest court. Trump's entire identity in this conflict was built on one thing: power, the power to impose, the power to punish, the power to make a smaller neighbor kneel. But today that image didn't crack, it shattered. And Canada? Canada didn't celebrate, it didn't gloat, it didn't say a word, because Canada had already won quietly, methodically, and months before the ruling ever came. This is not just a story about tariffs. It is not a story about trade percentages or economic data. This is a story about what happens when the most powerful nation on earth, armed with economic weapons, political threats, and the language of dominance, runs headfirst into an opponent that simply refuses to fear it. This is a story about how Canada, a country Trump called a candidate for the 51 Street state, turned that humiliation into fuel, about how Prime Minister Mark Carney sat across from Trump in the Oval Office twice without blinking, about how, step by step, Canada didn't just survive this war, it reshaped the entire dynamic. What you are about to hear is exactly how this unfolded: every turning point, every miscalculation, every moment Trump believed he was winning while Canada was building something he couldn't see, and how it ended in a legal catastrophe that nobody in Washington saw coming. February 1, 2025, Trump signs the executive order. 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods entering the United States, 10% on Canadian oil and energy. The math was simple. The logic was familiar. America buys $411.9 billion worth of Canadian goods every year. Canada's entire economy is deeply integrated with the United States, decades of trade, jobs, pipelines, supply chains, all running south across the border. The strategy was textbook: apply pressure, create pain, wait for the smaller neighbor to absorb the shock and fold. It had worked before. It was designed to work. Canada needed American markets far more than America needed Canadian goods, or at least that's what Washington believed. The expectation was not negotiation. The expectation was submission, and it was going to happen fast. Trump gave Canada a month's delay on February 3rd, a show of power, not mercy, and then on March 4th, the tariffs hit. Hard, and publicly, the narrative was already written. Canada would come crawling, but what Washington failed completely failed to understand was that Canada had already decided it wasn't going to play by that script. Canada didn't panic. Canada didn't collapse. Canada didn't rush to the phone to beg for relief. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It slowed time down. Within hours of the U.S. tariffs taking effect on March 4th, Canada launched simultaneous retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods. Not a threat, not a warning shot. An immediate, calibrated, equal response. Ontario Premier Doug Ford went further. He threatened to cut off electricity exports to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, 3 American states that rely on Canadian power. Instantly, the Buy Canadian campaign wasn't manufactured. It was organic. Canadians stopped buying American goods by choice. They stopped traveling to the United States. American liquor disappeared from Ontario shelves, not by law, by consumer decision. An entire cultural rejection of American economic dominance, spreading from province to province without a single government directive. Here is what Canada understood that Trump didn't. Pressure only works if the target believes time is running out. Canada proved week after week, month after month, that time was not running out for them, that they could endure. And the moment a target proves it can endure, the entire equation of power reverses. The early damage wasn't visible in headlines. It was visible in spreadsheets. American farmers lost access to key export markets. U.S. manufacturers in border states who relied on Canadian supply chains began absorbing new costs. Auto parts crossing the border, the same parts that feed American assembly lines, became more expensive. Steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada didn't just hurt Canadian producers. They raised costs for American industries that buy Canadian materials. Small disruptions. Nothing that made the front page, but beneath the surface, the numbers were building. the United States imported $411.9 billion from Canada in 2024. That relationship doesn't disappear because of an executive order. It creates friction, expensive compounding daily friction. Meanwhile, Canada quietly announced something that would define the next decade, a plan to double its non-US exports within 10 years, not as a protest, as a policy. Canada was systematically reducing its dependence on the American market, not in panic, but in preparation, and nobody in Washington was paying attention. Then the pressure moved inward. American businesses in border communities started lobbying against the tariffs. Supply chain executives in Michigan, Ohio, and New York states, where Canadian trade is not abstract but essential, began making calls to Washington. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce expressed concern. Agricultural groups grew louder. The economic logic of the tariffs was increasingly difficult to defend inside the country imposing them. Canada's unemployment reached its highest point in 9 years. Real damage, real people. But here is what made that fact politically devastating for Trump and not for Carney. Canada had already told its people this was coming. Mark Carney won the April 2025 election on a single clear message: the relationship with America is fundamentally changing, and Canada must build a stronger nation on its own terms. He won. Canadians had consented to the pain. Trump's base, meanwhile, started asking questions. Why are grocery prices up? Why are American auto workers facing higher parts costs? The pain was real on both sides of the border, but only one side had a leader who had prepared his people for it. Carney remained steady, calm, consistent. He did not raise his voice. He did not appear rattled. He said simply, "I don't wake up every day thinking about the U.S. relationship. I wake up thinking about how to make Canada stronger." That sentence, in the middle of an economic war, was more powerful than any tariff announcement. October 2025. And this is where you have to pay close attention, because the crack didn't come with a press release. It came with a tantrum. Ontario ran an advertisement. A simple ad featuring the recorded voice of Ronald Reagan, former U.S. president, conservative icon, criticizing tariffs, pointing out that Reagan himself believed high tariffs hurt American workers and fueled the Great Depression. The ad was factual. The speech was real. Reagan delivered it in 1987, and it was publicly available. Trump's response? He declared on Truth Social that all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated over an ad, a 30-second television spot using the recorded words of a deceased American president. Read that again. The most powerful nation on earth, running a coordinated economic war against a neighboring country, ended the negotiations. Because of a television commercial. This was not strategy. This was not leverage. This was a leader who had lost control of the narrative and was reacting, not calculating. The language of confident threats. Canada will be very happy. We'll make a deal. World-class leader had been replaced by impulsive declarations on social media. The rhythm of aggression had broken down. Canada did not respond in kind. Canada waited. Carney boarded a plane to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, deepening trade relationships with Southeast Asia, and said calmly from the tarmac, "We can't control the trade policy of the United States," composed, measured, and devastating. Then came February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court delivered its ruling in Learning Resources, Inc. v. Trump. The entire legal foundation of Trump's tariff regime, built on emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, was ruled unconstitutional. The court struck down not just the Canada tariffs but the global architecture of Trump's trade war. Reuters described it as a stinging defeat for the Republican president. But here is what made it a complete reversal of power. The ruling didn't come because Trump conceded. It came because Canada had bought enough time for the legal process to run its course. Every month Canada held firm was another month the legal challenge could work its way through the federal courts. Every month Canada didn't collapse. Proved the emergency justification for the tariffs was unsustainable. Canada didn't negotiate from pain. It negotiated from patience, and patience won not at a bargaining table, but in the Supreme Court of the United States. Trump was forced to begin building an entirely new replacement framework for his tariffs, one that didn't yet exist. The administration that had entered this war with absolute confidence was now scrambling to find a legal mechanism to continue. They were starting over. Canada didn't rush to accept the outcome. It waited, assessed, and observed because negotiating to win is fundamentally different than negotiating to stop bleeding. Trump was bleeding. Canada had already moved on. The terms were not soft. They were not symbolic. Canada's position entering any new discussion was now this: the tariffs were illegal, not politically inconvenient, legally void. The U.S. Supreme Court had confirmed it. Any new tariff framework would face the same legal scrutiny. American businesses were now owed refunds for tariffs illegally collected. A federal judge ordered those refunds to begin. Canada had already launched WTO dispute resolution proceedings in March 2025. Those proceedings were still active. The retaliatory framework $30 billion in counter tariffs, ready to scale to $155 billion, was still in place and legally valid. Canada's position was fortified, not weakened, and it had already begun the structural work of reducing dependence on the American market. The 51-state state threat, the language of annexation and dominance that Trump had used publicly and repeatedly, had produced the opposite of its intended effect. Canadian national identity had hardened. Support for a firm stance against Washington had grown. To a majority of the population, Angus Reid polling confirmed it. Canadians wanted to take a hard line. They had given their government the political mandate to hold. Mark Carney stated the terms plainly: the era of drawing ever closer to the United States is over. Our relationship will never again be what it was. This was not frustration. This was not emotion. This was a policy declaration, a permanent recalibration of the bilateral relationship on Canada's terms, announced calmly, without drama, and backed by a Supreme Court ruling that made it impossible to argue otherwise. Zoom out. Because what just happened is larger than one trade dispute between two neighboring countries. The United States entered this conflict with every structural advantage: the world's largest economy, reserve currency dominance, military power, and the threat of market exclusion. Canada entered it as the smaller partner, the country that, for nearly 4 decades, had built its economic life in close alignment with its powerful neighbor. And yet, Canada held. Canada diversified. Canada built a political mandate for resistance through a democratic election. Canada's judiciary, not Canada's, but America's, ultimately dismantled the weapon being used against it. Every assumption of how the smaller partner would behave was wrong. Every calculation about how long Canada could endure was miscalculated. The lesson was not lost on the rest of the world. Governments watching this conflict in Europe, in Asia, in the global South drew a single conclusion: American economic coercion is not inevitable. It can be absorbed. It can be outlasted. And when the legal and institutional frameworks of the United States itself reject the coercion, even the raw power of the world's largest economy reaches its limits. This was never just a story about tariffs. It was a global demonstration, broadcast in real time, that endurance and strategic patience can neutralize raw power. The trade war is over, but the new reality it created is permanent. Canada proved something that cannot be unproven, and the world was watching.